In the autumn of 1823, deep within the dense woodlands of southeastern Ohio, a young woman was found wandering naked. Her body marred by strange, precise, geometric scars that defied any medical explanation. Margaret Hayes, only 22 years old, had been missing for over 3 months. Discovered by local hunters, she mumbled incoherently about sessions and a chair with leather straps. 3 respected doctors in the area examined her, but none were willing to continue her treatment. The county magistrate sealed her case, burying it in archives, where it would remain hidden for almost 2 centuries. What those doctors found was so disturbing that Dr. Edmund Cartwright, one of them, reportedly burned his notes and left Ohio for good. Tonight we'll unravel the chilling truth behind Margaret's case, a story that exposes the darkest side of early American medicine and the dangers of unchecked scientific ambition. Before we dive into the tragic tale of Margaret Hayes and the horrifying discoveries that led 3 physicians to abandon their medical vows, hit that subscribe button. If you're brave enough to explore stories most would rather forget. These aren't just stories. They're fragments of real history that powerful people tried to erase. Leave a comment below telling me where you're listening from. And let's build a community of truth seekers, no matter how dark the truth might be. Margaret's ordeal began in the summer of 1823, when she vanished from her small farming community near what is now Athens County, Ohio. The Ohio frontier of that time was a brutal place where survival was a daily struggle, and the boundaries between civilization and wilderness were razor thin. Margaret lived with her widowed father Thomas on a modest farm about 12 miles south of Athens, in a settlement known simply as Millfield. The settlement, home to around 40 families, mostly transplants from Pennsylvania and Virginia, was a place for those seeking a new life in the Ohio Territory. Margaret was an exceptional young woman, known for her sharp mind and impressive intellect. She could read and write fluently, a rarity for women in frontier America. Her father, a former school teacher, had educated her beyond what most considered suitable for a woman of her time. Margaret kept detailed journals, read medical texts borrowed from the town's physician, and exchanged letters with relatives in Pennsylvania, showcasing her sharp wit and curious nature. The Hayes family lived in a log cabin that Thomas had built, surrounded by cleared fields where they grew corn, wheat, and vegetables. Their closest neighbors, the Brennan family, lived nearly a mile away. Life on the frontier was often solitary, and when trouble struck, help was far away. Samuel Hardwell, the settlement's only physician, was a methodical man in his 50s, trained in Philadelphia before moving west in 1819. He had treated Margaret on several occasions for minor issues, from a broken wrist to a severe fever, and had always found her to be healthy, intelligent, and resilient. However, the summer of 1823 proved difficult for the Hayes family. Thomas injured his back during the spring planting, leaving Margaret to handle most of the farm work. Neighbors noticed she seemed more withdrawn and exhausted. Mary Brennan, the nearest neighbor, later told investigators that Margaret had stopped visiting in late June, which was unusual since the 2 women had become friends despite their different backgrounds. What made Margaret's disappearance especially unsettling was its suddenness. On the morning of July 15th, 1823, Thomas woke to find his daughter's bed empty. Her personal belongings, including her precious journals, gone. There were no signs of struggle, no forced entry, and no note explaining her departure. He immediately organized a search party, but despite combing the surrounding forest for days, no trace of Margaret was found. The dense woodlands of Ohio at the time were still untamed, with thick canopies of oak, maple, and hickory trees that created a perpetual twilight under their branches. Wild animals like wolves and bears roamed the land, and it was easy to get lost in the maze of trees, streams, and ravines. Weeks passed, and the search yielded no clues. The settlement began to speculate about what might have happened to her. Some thought she'd been taken by wild animals. Others suspected she had been kidnapped by Native Americans, although no tribes had been seen in the area for over a year. A few suggested she had run away, perhaps to elope with a young man from a neighboring settlement, but those who knew her dismissed this theory. Margaret had shown no interest in marriage and had often expressed contentment with her life in Millfield. Then, on the morning of October 23, 1823, two local hunters, James Fletcher and his teenage son Robert, were tracking deer in the woods about 8 miles northeast of Millfield. They heard a strange sound, initially mistaking it for an animal in distress. It was a low rhythmic moaning, but as they drew closer, it became clear it was a human voice. The words were fragmented and disjointed, punctuated by long silences and bursts of desperate pleading. The hunters exchanged worried glances. James, having spent decades in these woods, had never heard anything like it. They followed the sound and found Margaret in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from Miller's Creek, a tributary of the Hawking River. Margaret Hayes sat cross-legged on the forest floor, her naked form unsettling in its stillness. Her long dark hair hung in matted tangles around her shoulders. She rocked back and forth, her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, speaking in a voice that was eerily familiar, yet disturbingly different, flatter, more mechanical. "The sessions must continue," she repeated over and over. "The chair with leather straps. The observations are incomplete. The subject requires additional stimulus." Then, as if on cue, she would lapse into silence for 30 seconds before resuming with subtle variations. "The sessions must continue. The measurements are not yet precise. The subject shows promising reactions to the copper instruments." James Fletcher, a battle-hardened veteran of the War of 1812, later confessed to Dr. Hartwell that witnessing Margaret's condition was the most disturbing experience of his life. It wasn't just her nakedness or the apparent madness in her demeanor. It was the condition of her body. Even from a distance, James could see the strange scars covering her, not random marks, but intricate geometric patterns, angles and lines that seemed almost like mathematical diagrams carved into her skin. Robert Fletcher, his teenage son, tried to approach Margaret, but as he drew near, her head snapped up suddenly. Her eyes, once bright with intelligence, now appeared distant and unfocused, as though she were seeing something far beyond the forest clearing. She began to speak more rapidly, her voice rising. "The doctor requires compliance. The measurements must be exact. The subject will remain still during the procedure. The copper instruments must be heated to the proper temperature." With growing concern, the hunters wrapped her in James's hunting jacket and carried her back to the settlement, where Dr. Hartwell was summoned immediately. What he found in the privacy of his small clinic would challenge everything he knew about medicine, human nature, and the limits of scientific exploration. Dr. Samuel Hartwell had practiced medicine for over 20 years, first in Philadelphia, then on the rugged Ohio frontier. He had treated battlefield wounds, delivered babies in frontier cabins, and diagnosed illnesses that defied medical knowledge at the time. But nothing had prepared him for what he found when he examined Margaret Hayes. The geometric scars on her body were no accident. They were deliberate, methodical incisions made with surgical precision. Each cut exactly the same depth, about 1/8 of an inch, was arranged in patterns that seemed to align with anatomical landmarks. Lines radiated from specific points on her body, almost like a map of her muscular and nervous systems. Hartwell's examination revealed 17 separate scar patterns, each with multiple cuts made at different times. their precision indicating that the person responsible possessed detailed anatomical knowledge and surgical expertise. The scars had healed cleanly, suggesting careful medical treatment during their recovery. But it was Margaret's behavior that truly disturbed Dr. Hartwell. She would sit motionless for hours, her eyes vacant, only to suddenly begin speaking in that same mechanical voice. She would describe medical procedures in clinical detail, referring to herself in the third person as the subject, speaking of measurements and observations made on her body. The subject's response to electrical stimulus was recorded on day 47. She would say, her tone devoid of any emotion. The copper probes inserted at precise locations along the spinal column. The subject's verbal responses indicate heightened sensitivity in the lower lumbar region. The doctor was pleased with the results and authorized continuation of the experiment. Dr. Hartwell attempted various treatments, administering laudanum to calm her gentle questioning to understand what had happened during her 3 months of absence. Even attempts at hypnosis using techniques he had learned in Philadelphia. But nothing broke through the barrier that separated Margaret from the outside world. She would respond to questions about basic needs, like food, water, and warmth. But whenever asked about her experiences during the 3 months she had been missing, she would revert to her recitation of clinical observations. The most disturbing part of her condition was how she sometimes addressed him as doctor, expecting him to continue whatever experiments had been performed on her. She would position herself in specific poses, lying on her side with her arms extended, or sitting upright with her head tilted at a particular angle, waiting expectantly for Dr. Hartwell to perform some action. When he failed to respond, as she seemed to expect, she would grow agitated, repeating phrases about protocol and the need to continue the work. After 3 days of examination, Dr. Hartwell reached a conclusion that shook him to his core. Margaret Hayes had been subjected to systematic medical experimentation by someone with deep knowledge of human anatomy and a mastery of surgical techniques. The scars, her behavior, and her use of clinical vocabulary all pointed to a sustained period of abuse disguised as scientific research. But who could have done such a thing? And why did Margaret appear to cooperate with procedures that must have caused her immense pain and psychological damage? The answers to these questions would prove even more horrifying than Dr. Hartwell had imagined, and they would eventually drive him to make a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Hartwell began his investigation by carefully examining Margaret's possessions, which had been scattered throughout the forest near where she had been found. Among the items was her journal, which had been missing since her disappearance. It was found wedged between 2 fallen logs, about 50 yards from the clearing. Though the leather cover was water-damaged and many pages were illegible enough, remained to provide disturbing insights into her final weeks before vanishing. The early entries were typical of Margaret's writing. Dr. Hartwell stood in the dimly lit room, his heart pounding in his chest as he took in the grim scene before him. It was the first time he had allowed himself to truly entertain the horrifying possibilities surrounding Margaret's condition, but now standing in what could only be described as a medical hell. Those possibilities were no longer theoretical. They were terrifyingly real. The back room of the Westfield house, once a place of comfort and prosperity, had been transformed into a gruesome laboratory. The large wooden table in the center was stained dark, its surface marked with the unmistakable signs of blood. Leather restraints worn with heavy use were fixed to the table, placed at intervals to match the human form. Wrists, ankles, waist, and neck, each of them showing the telltale signs of someone who had fought against their bonds. Along the walls, Dr. Hartwell found medical instruments that seemed both familiar and out of place in such a remote, dilapidated setting. Surgical knives, clean sharp and meticulously maintained, lined a wooden shelf. but it was the array of copper probes connected by wires to a makeshift electrical apparatus that caused his blood to freeze in his veins. The device appeared to be an approximation of the voltaic pile, the early electrical generator used in experiments to study electrical currents in the body. The kind of equipment he'd read about in medical texts, the kind of equipment used in university laboratories, not on a secluded farmstead. What he had stumbled upon in the Westfield house was something deeply disturbing, a sophisticated medical setup, but one tainted with unspeakable horrors. The thought that someone, likely a skilled individual with access to the finest equipment, had conducted such experiments potentially on Margaret left him reeling. As Dr. Hartwell continued his examination of the room, he noticed small but telling details. A discarded journal lay on the floor near the table. The handwriting inside was elegant but detached, clinical, as if the author had long ago abandoned all human empathy in the pursuit of some twisted scientific ambition. The notes were heavily detailed, outlining various experiments with electrical stimulation measurements of nerve responses and a precise chronology of sessions, all focusing on the subject's physical and emotional reactions. The mention of leather restraints in the journal was not an isolated reference, nor was it a mere theoretical notion. The pages detailed the exact setup of the experiments down to the depth at which copper probes should be inserted into the skin to avoid permanent injury to the nervous system. Each session had a strict duration, never exceeding 30 minutes, and the subject was to be given ample time to recover between sessions. Who could have carried out such atrocities? In the name of science, Dr. Hartwell's mind raced as he absorbed the implications of these findings. It was clear now that Margaret Hayes had been subjected to something much more sinister than a simple medical procedure gone awry. She had been part of a cruel, calculated experiment, one designed to push the boundaries of human endurance and knowledge. Yet, as troubling as these revelations were, they raised even more chilling questions. Who was the doctor behind this madness? Who had been pulling the strings, orchestrating these torturous sessions on a young woman who had once been nothing more than a curious and intelligent member of their community? And why had Margaret, intelligent, thoughtful, and strong-willed, consented to such inhumane procedures? Dr. Hartwell's stomach churned at the thought of what must have transpired in those months Margaret had gone missing. The woman he had known, the young woman who had shown so much promise, had now become something entirely different. The terms of consent in the journal made it clear that Margaret, at least at one point, had agreed to these procedures willingly, or at least had been convinced to do so under the guise of scientific progress. The chilling phrase from her journal still echoed in his mind. The doctor explains that pain is temporary, but scientific knowledge is eternal. The realization settled over him like a dark cloud. Margaret had been manipulated, her consent extracted through some form of persuasion or coercion. She had believed she was partaking in a noble cause, a cause that had ultimately destroyed her. And now Dr. Hartwell faced the truth that no amount of medical training could have prepared him for someone within their own community was capable of committing monstrous acts in the name of science. The physician took a final glance at the room, his mind heavy with the weight of the discovery. He knew he had to act quickly, but even as he left the Westfield property and headed back to Millfield, a creeping sense of dread followed him. The pieces were falling into place, but each new discovery only raised more questions, questions that perhaps would never be fully answered. Who had Margaret trusted? And who was the shadowy figure who had so expertly twisted her understanding of what was truly happening to her? Dr. Hartwell could not yet say. But one thing was certain: Margaret Hayes's case had opened a door to horrors far beyond anything he could have ever imagined. And the answers might just be more terrifying than the questions themselves. Dr. Elias Cunningham's face betrayed no emotion, but there was a subtle tightening around his jaw as he gazed down at the journal and clinical notes Dr. Hartwell had placed before him. His fingers twitched almost imperceptibly, as if he were resisting the urge to reach for the papers, to tear them apart, or dismiss them as the ravings of an overzealous colleague. But he did not. Instead, he sat back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him, and fixed Dr. Hartwell with a cold, calculating gaze. "Well?" Cunningham said, his voice steady. "I suppose you've come to ask questions. What is it you want to know, Samuel?" Dr. Hartwell's stomach turned as he struggled to maintain his composure. He had read the journal entries over and over during his journey to Athens, each word more horrifying than the last. The detailed descriptions of Margaret suffering her transformation from a curious and intelligent woman into a compliant subject, her gradual surrender to the experimental procedures, had gnawed at him every step of the way. The discovery of Cunningham's handwriting in those notes had confirmed what he had dreaded. The man sitting before him was responsible for the horrific experiments that had been carried out on Margaret Hayes. "How could you do this?" Dr. Hartwell's voice cracked slightly as he spoke, though he quickly regained control. "How could you, a man of your standing, conduct such experiments? You knew the pain you were causing. You knew what you were doing was wrong." Cunningham remained silent for a moment, his eyes never leaving Dr. Hartwell's face. Finally, he spoke, his tone calm, almost measured. "You don't understand, Samuel. You don't understand the importance of what I was doing. This wasn't about causing pain. It was about understanding the human body in ways no one else has. It was about progress, about pushing the boundaries of knowledge. It was about science." Dr. Hartwell's mind reeled. The man before him, the respected physician, the Harvard-trained doctor, the celebrated expert in his field, was justifying what amounted to a grotesque violation of every medical and ethical principle he had ever held. The idea that Cunningham viewed Margaret as little more than a tool for his research, that he had seen her as an object of study and not as a human being, was sickening. "Science," Dr. Hartwell echoed, his voice trembling with disbelief. "What you did was not science, Elias. It was torture. You subjected Margaret to experiments without her full understanding, without her consent. You manipulated her into believing she was part of something noble, something necessary." Cunningham's expression hardened, his lips tightening into a thin line. "You think I manipulated her?" he asked, his voice taking on a hint of disdain. "She volunteered. She understood the work we were doing. She chose to participate. You have no idea what it means to make real scientific discoveries, what it costs, the sacrifices that must be made. And yes, there are always casualties. But think of the knowledge we gained. Think of what we can do with that knowledge." The words hung in the air, suffocating as Dr. Hartwell fought to suppress the bile rising in his throat. "You call this progress?" he spat. "What about the human cost? What about the lives you've destroyed in the name of your so-called research, Margaret? She was a person, not a subject, not an experiment." Cunningham's eyes narrowed, and for the first time, Dr. Hartwell saw something that could almost be described as a flicker of emotion, something dark and unyielding. "You are naive, Samuel," Cunningham said quietly. "You still believe in the ideals of medical ethics, in compassion, in the sanctity of life. But you cannot achieve greatness with such limitations. If you want to change the world, if you want to advance humanity, you must be willing to sacrifice. You must be willing to push beyond the boundaries of what is considered acceptable." Dr. Hartwell could no longer remain calm. The man before him was a monster, cloaked in the respectable garb of a learned physician. But at his core, he was a man who had lost his humanity in pursuit of knowledge. "You're a monster," Dr. Hartwell said, his voice low and filled with revulsion. "What you did to Margaret, what you're still defending, It's unforgivable." For a long moment, neither man spoke. The weight of the accusation hung between them like a palpable force. Finally, Cunningham broke the silence. "If you're going to report me," he said coldly, "you'd better be prepared for the consequences. You're nothing but a small-town physician, Samuel. I have connections. Powerful connections. You're not the first to accuse me of overstepping, and you won't be the last. But you won't succeed. No one will believe you. No one will take your word over mine. I've built a reputation, and you will be the one to suffer for this." Dr. Hartwell stood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Maybe you're right," he said through gritted teeth. "Maybe I'll never prove what you've done. But I will try, and you will not escape the consequences of your actions. There's always a reckoning, Elias. Always." With that, he turned and walked out of Cunningham's study, leaving the older physician behind, his words of warning lingering in the air like a poisonous cloud. Dr. Hartwell knew this was only the beginning. He had uncovered a dark and horrifying truth, but the battle to expose it was far from over. And as he left Cunningham's house, his mind raced with the chilling possibility, if Dr. Cunningham had been able to hide his crimes for this long, what else might be buried in the shadows of frontier medicine? Dr. Hartwell's stomach twisted with a mixture of disgust and dread as Cunningham casually continued his words, seemingly without remorse. The younger physician could barely comprehend the scope of what he was hearing. Cunningham's words were like a cold, methodical dissection of his own moral compass, each sentence further unraveling the horrific reality of the crimes he had committed. The older man's pale blue eyes flicked to the sketches laid out on his desk. The faces of those whose lives had been irrevocably altered or ended in the name of what he called scientific progress. Cunningham's detached tone never wavered, as though he were discussing nothing more than a set of routine observations. Margaret Hayes, of course, was exceptional. A true outlier. You see, Dr. Hartwell, these aren't just subjects. They are the cornerstone of a revolution in medical science, Cunningham said, leaning back in his chair, his hands folded in his lap as if he were explaining an academic concept to a disinterested pupil. Dr. Hartwell felt the weight of the portfolio in his hands, the drawings of those people, those victims. And he could barely process the horror. These were real people faces, forever marked by Cunningham's twisted experiments. Subject A, James Patterson, age 24, the first label read. Subject C, Sarah Mills, age 19. Each face beneath the neat anatomical markings, each victim beneath Cunningham's detached observations. How many more? Dr. Hartwell's voice broke through the silence, hoarse and filled with disbelief. How many others have there been? 8, Cunningham replied coolly, his fingers tapping the table with a rhythm that felt disturbingly casual. Margaret was subject G, the 7th in my current research series. The previous subjects were useful in their own way, though none had her capacity for endurance. Most expired before I could complete the full experimental protocol. But Margaret was the one who truly showed potential. The words were almost too much to bear, but Dr. Hartwell pressed on, his anger rising, despite the sick feeling that churned in his gut. And you convinced them to willingly submit to this, to allow you to mutilate them in the name of science. Cunningham's lips curled into a thin, almost dismissive smile. It's not as simple as you think. People like Margaret are ideal candidates. They are hungry for something greater, a chance to be part of something meaningful. I offered her that opportunity. How could she resist? His eyes flicked to the sketches again, almost lovingly, as if his experiments were works of art. It's always the isolated ones, people with little connection to the world around them. Young, intelligent, and curious, often with no idea what real medical research entails. Dr. Hartwell gripped the edge of the desk, fighting the wave of nausea threatening to overwhelm him. You groomed them, lied to them. You made them believe they were part of something noble, something groundbreaking, and you used them for your own twisted ambitions. Cunningham leaned forward slightly, his gaze sharpening. It's not manipulation, Samuel. It's a necessary step toward progress. Medicine is shackled by ethical concerns, by societal limitations. My work breaks free of those chains. You can't hope to make advances without a little sacrifice. Don't you see, this is how science moves forward? Dr. Hartwell's hands trembled as he turned over one of the pages in the journal. Glancing at the dates, the detailed descriptions of the procedures each day, marking another terrifying step in the systematic destruction of a human being for the sake of research. He felt his voice falter, but he forced it out, his words burning with conviction. What you did to them, to Margaret, it's not science. It's sadism masquerading as discovery. You've destroyed lives, Elias. Cunningham's expression hardened at the accusation, but he said nothing in defense. Instead, he pulled another folder from his desk, revealing another set of notes that Dr. Hartwell could not bear to read. The handwriting was precise, clinical, with none of the emotion that would be expected from someone who had just described such horrific acts. I don't expect you to understand, Cunningham said coldly, still not looking directly at him. But what I've done will lay the groundwork for future treatments. The knowledge gained from this series will help thousands, maybe millions of people. Every experiment, every subject, brings us closer to saving lives in ways that traditional methods never could. Dr. Hartwell stood frozen, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what he was hearing. He had suspected that Cunningham's ambitions had gone too far, but the reality was even worse than he could have imagined. The older physician's pursuit of knowledge had twisted into an obsession with no regard for the humanity of those he had used. How many more are there, Elias? Dr. Hartwell's voice was barely a whisper, but the weight of the question was palpable. How many have you ruined for your... 8, Cunningham repeated calmly. But there are others in the future. I've laid the foundation. It won't end here. The field of medicine is on the verge of a breakthrough, and I will be the one to lead it. Dr. Hartwell took a step back, the full weight of his responsibility dawning on him. Cunningham had opened a door to horrors he could never unsee, and now he would have to find a way to expose the truth. There were lives at stake. Real lives, not just the ones Cunningham had destroyed, but the ones who would be hurt by the ripple effect of these dark discoveries. Turning on his heel, Dr. Hartwell left Cunningham's study, the weight of the moment settling heavily on his shoulders. There was no going back from this. The truth had to be brought to light no matter the cost. The lives lost in Cunningham's pursuit of knowledge would not be in vain, not while Dr. Hartwell still had the strength to fight for them. Dr. Hartwell's breath caught in his throat as he processed Cunningham's cold, detached response to the revelation of his monstrous acts. The older physician spoke of human lives lost with the same clinical precision he used in his research. He seemed to view the death of those 6 people not as a tragedy, but as a necessary byproduct of progress. It was chilling. Cunningham's indifference was so complete it felt almost inhuman. The forest is vast, and there are many deep ravines and abandoned mine shafts in this region, he said casually. Their remains serve no further purpose for my research. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Dr. Hartwell could feel his blood run cold as he fought to maintain control. He rose from his chair, his fists clenched at his sides. Your research ends now, Cunningham. I have documented evidence of your crimes, and I will present it to the State Attorney General. You will face justice. The reaction was swift and chilling. Cunningham's face hardened as he stood and moved toward a cabinet. In a flash, the clinical, detached demeanor he had maintained throughout their conversation shifted into something darker. "You will do nothing," he said, his voice icy, filled with a quiet menace. "I have spent years developing this research, and I will not let some frontier physician destroy it." Dr. Hartwell watched in horror as Cunningham withdrew a surgical knife from the cabinet, his hand steady, his grip practiced. "I have influential friends throughout this region." Cunningham continued, his voice cold and threatening. "Judges, prosecutors, wealthy merchants who depend on my expertise. Who do you think will be believed? A respected, Harvard-trained physician conducting important research, or a country doctor making wild accusations based on the ravings of a mentally disturbed woman?" Dr. Hartwell's pulse raced as Cunningham advanced toward him with the knife. The older physician was a man who had no qualms about using violence to protect his secrets, and Dr. Hartwell knew that if this confrontation escalated, he might not walk out of the room alive. Margaret Hayes was found wandering in the forest, clearly insane. Cunningham continued, his eyes narrowing. Any scars on her body can be explained as self-inflicted wounds caused by her mental condition. There is no credible evidence of any crime, and there never will be. Dr. Hartwell's heart hammered in his chest, but he had anticipated this. He had prepared for the likelihood that Cunningham would try to silence him. In various hidden locations around Millfield were copies of the evidence he had gathered, along with detailed letters describing Cunningham's crimes. If anything happened to him, those documents would be delivered to the authorities in Columbus, ensuring that Cunningham's monstrous actions would eventually come to light. "I have prepared for this conversation, Cunningham," Dr. Hartwell said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He backed toward the door, keeping his eyes fixed on the surgical knife. "If anything happens to me, copies of your research notes and journal entries will be delivered to the governor, the state attorney general, and several newspaper editors. Your crimes will be exposed regardless of your connections." For the first time, Dr. Hartwell saw something shift in Cunningham's expression. A flicker of uncertainty. A brief pause as he processed the implications of the threat. "You're bluffing," Cunningham said, his voice losing its conviction. "Am I?" Dr. Hartwell asked, his voice calm but filled with determination. "Are you willing to stake your reputation and your freedom on that assumption?" The tension in the room was palpable, as if both men could feel the weight of what was about to happen. Cunningham, seemingly unwilling to allow Dr. Hartwell to walk away, lunged forward with the surgical knife, his face twisted in anger and fear. Dr. Hartwell's military training kicked in, his reflexes still sharp despite his years. He dodged the initial thrust, the knife missing him by inches. The two men struggled violently, knocking over chairs and sending medical instruments scattering across the floor. Cunningham, though older, was desperate, and his strength was fueled by his desire to protect his twisted empire of research. Dr. Hartwell, driven by righteous fury, fought with everything he had, his hands steady as he struggled to survive. In the end, it was Cunningham's own desperation that proved his undoing. As they grappled, Cunningham lost his footing, stumbling backward and falling onto his desk. The surgical knife twisted in his hand, and the blade plunged into his chest. Dr. Hartwell froze, watching as the life drained from Cunningham's eyes, his last words, a cold complaint about the interruption of his important work. The room fell silent. Dr. Hartwell stood over the man who had orchestrated the deaths of 7 innocent people, the man who had twisted medical science into a grotesque tool of abuse. And yet, despite everything, there was no sense of triumph. Only a grim, unshakable knowledge of the darkness he had uncovered. What followed in the immediate aftermath of Cunningham's death would haunt Dr. Hartwell for the rest of his life. He could have reported the truth that Cunningham had died in self-defense during a confrontation about his horrific experiments. But doing so would expose Margaret once again, subjecting her to further trauma and perhaps ruining the fragile trust the community had in the medical profession. Instead, Dr. Hartwell chose a more complex path. He arranged the scene to look like an accident during a medical procedure gone wrong. When the Athens County Sheriff, Robert Mason, conducted the investigation, Cunningham's status as a respected physician ensured that the accident theory was accepted without question. No one thought to look deeper. Dr. Hartwell used the hours after Cunningham's death to destroy every piece of evidence of his crimes. The research notes, the anatomical sketches, the records, everything was burned. The surgical instruments were thrown into the Hawking River, the electrical apparatus dismantled and scattered across several county dumps. The Westfield property was similarly erased. Dr. Hartwell, along with 2 trusted friends, cleared out the makeshift laboratory, burning the restraint table and burying the medical instruments in separate locations. The room itself was cleaned thoroughly, leaving no trace of the horrors that had taken place within its walls. But Dr. Hartwell could not destroy the one piece of evidence that mattered most, Margaret Hayes herself. Her condition, though slightly improved, remained a constant reminder of Cunningham's crimes. Caring for her became his primary responsibility, and in many ways his penance for failing to stop the experiment sooner. As Dr. Hartwell continued to care for Margaret, he knew that the truth, what had happened to her and to the other victims, would never be fully known. But he also knew that in some ways his actions had been a form of redemption, however incomplete. The darkness of Cunningham's legacy would not be easily erased, but Dr. Hartwell could only hope that in time, Margaret would find some measure of peace. Margaret's recovery, though gradual, was deeply incomplete. The psychological scars left by the relentless experiments were too profound, and no treatment of the time could undo the damage Cunningham had inflicted. For weeks after his death, Margaret remained trapped in an emotional and psychological haze, frequently slipping into those chilling mechanical speech patterns that had so disturbed the hunters who found her in the forest. Her voice, flat and emotionless, would repeat fragments of clinical observations, as though her mind had become a broken record of the experiments that had torn her apart. The subject's response to stimulus was recorded. She would recite, staring vacantly at the wall of Dr. Hartwell's modest clinic. The measurements were precise. The doctor was pleased with the progress. The sessions will continue tomorrow. During these episodes, Margaret appeared completely disconnected from the world around her, lost in the memories of her torment. Dr. Hartwell, in his efforts to heal her, tried everything within his power. Herbal remedies, soothing conversation, even experimental therapies from the medical journals he had read. But nothing seemed to break the psychological barriers Cunningham had erected. It was as if Margaret's mind had been sealed off from the trauma, unable or unwilling to process what had happened to her. But over time, small improvements began to show. The episodes became less frequent, less intense, and shorter in duration. She started to recognize Dr. Hartwell and other familiar faces. There were moments, brief but precious, when she would speak in her own voice about simple, immediate concerns, hunger, cold, or discomfort. However, the bright spark of intelligence that had once made Margaret so remarkable was gone. The woman who had been so curious, so intellectually sharp, was now a shadow of herself, struggling with the psychological chains Cunningham had forged. Despite her slow, partial recovery, Dr. Hartwell knew that Margaret would never fully regain the person she had been before. He could not undo the horrors she had endured, and the damage to her mind was likely permanent. In an attempt to give her some semblance of stability, Dr. Hartwell arranged for Margaret's long-term care through a network of Quaker families in Pennsylvania, who specialized in taking care of people with mental disturbances. He corresponded with colleagues in Philadelphia who had treated similar patients, hoping they could offer guidance on how best to support Margaret. Though he could never reveal the true nature of her trauma without implicating himself and exposing Cunningham's crimes, Dr. Hartwell did everything he could to ensure Margaret received the best care possible. The financial burden of her care was heavy, and it fell entirely on Dr. Hartwell's shoulders. In order to pay for her treatment, he sold his medical practice in Millfield and used the proceeds to establish a trust fund for her. He moved to a smaller farm outside the settlement where he could live quietly and continue to practice medicine on a limited basis. He never charged families who could not afford to pay, always using his income to support Margaret's ongoing care. As for Thomas Hayes, he never learned the full truth about what had happened to his daughter. Dr. Hartwell told him that Margaret had suffered a mental breakdown after being lost in the forest, and that she would require permanent care in a facility designed for such conditions. Perhaps Thomas chose to accept this explanation because the alternative, the horrific truth that his daughter had been systematically tortured by a respected physician, was simply too terrible to bear. Thomas passed away in 1825, 2 years after Margaret's disappearance, never recovering from the trauma of losing his daughter and his own feelings of guilt and helplessness. His final words, according to a neighbor, were an apology to Margaret for failing to protect her. The Hayes farm was abandoned after Thomas's death, and eventually it reverted to the state. In 1828, new settlers purchased the property, unaware of the tragic history that had unfolded there. The house was torn down and rebuilt, and the land was cleared for different crops, erasing the physical traces of the family's once quiet existence. Yet the scars of the past remained carried silently by those who had been touched by the darkness that had unfolded in their midst. Dr. Hartwell visited Margaret regularly during the 15 years between Cunningham's death and his own passing in 1838. These visits were a bittersweet ritual, providing some comfort to both of them, but also serving as a painful reminder of the horrors he had failed to prevent. Margaret seemed to recognize him, and her presence would calm her in moments of distress. But she never spoke about the 3 months she had spent in Cunningham's care. The silence surrounding those lost months became a barrier she would never cross. The Quaker family who cared for Margaret reported that she lived peacefully, performing simple tasks around the house, and occasionally showing flashes of the intelligence that had once made her so special. She would discuss books and engage in conversations about everyday topics. But she never formed any close relationships, never married, and never fully escaped the psychological prison Cunningham had constructed for her. Dr. Hartwell's private papers discovered after his death revealed the weight of the burden he had carried for over a decade. In a letter written shortly before his death, he confessed that the decision to cover up Cunningham's crimes had been the most difficult choice of my life. But he believed it was the only way to prevent further suffering. "I have saved 1 life," he wrote, "but I failed to save 6 others. The weight of that failure will follow me to my grave. I pray that history will judge me not for my silence about these crimes, but for my efforts to ensure that they never happen again." Among the papers found after his death was a note attached to his medical bag and instruments. It read, "Some tools of healing become instruments of remembrance for what we could not prevent. May those who find these understand that medicine is a sacred trust that must never be betrayed." The 3 doctors who had initially refused to treat Margaret, Dr. Hartwell, Dr. Marcus Webb from Athens, and Dr. Joseph Sterling from Lancaster, had all recognized that her condition was the result of systematic abuse. However, none of them had the courage to confront the truth at the time. Dr. Hartwell, in the end, had taken on the responsibility of both caring for Margaret and protecting her from the wider world, forever haunted by the knowledge of what had happened under Cunningham's guise of scientific advancement. Dr. Hartwell, despite the weight of the atrocities he had uncovered and the personal toll it took on him, had always recognized the limitations of the frontier system in which he lived. His refusal to treat Margaret wasn't an act of abandonment. It was in his mind a recognition that the trauma she had suffered at the hands of Dr. Cunningham was beyond the reach of conventional medical care. The kind of horrors Margaret had endured required a depth of intervention and understanding that no one, especially a country doctor with limited resources, could provide. In the years that followed, Dr. Hartwell withdrew from the medical community. He sold his remaining medical equipment in 1830 and withdrew entirely from his practice. Settling into a quiet, modest life on a small farm, he focused on raising a few animals and quietly tending to his land. Neighbors described him as a kind but sorrowful man. He would provide medical care in emergencies, but there was always an air of sadness about him, as if a tragedy he could never speak of lingered in his every gesture. The story of Margaret Hayes and the twisted experiments of Dr. Cunningham remained buried in the shadows of history for nearly 2 centuries. The sealed records and the silence of those who knew the truth preserved the horrific secrets of that time. It wasn't until the 1990s, when Athens County courthouse records were being digitized, that a researcher stumbled upon an anomaly, a file marked confidential, containing Dr. Hartwell's sealed report about the unusual medical circumstances involving Margaret Hayes. This discovery sparked a limited investigation that unearthed fragmented pieces of the story. Though the investigation uncovered the basics of Margaret's ordeal, it could not provide a full picture of the scope of Dr. Cunningham's crimes or the fate of his other victims. Despite archaeological surveys of the Westfield property and the surrounding areas, no human remains were found, suggesting Cunningham's thoroughness in covering his tracks. Margaret Hayes lived out the remainder of her life in peace, far from the horrors she had endured. She passed away in 1847 at the age of 46 in the Quaker household that had cared for her for over 2 decades. Her death was recorded simply as natural causes following a long illness, with no mention of the trauma that had so deeply affected her adult life. She was buried in a small cemetery outside Philadelphia, and her gravestone bore only her name and dates of birth and death, an unremarkable marker for a life that had been anything but ordinary. The case of Margaret Hayes remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of American medicine. It stands as a grim reminder of how the isolation and lack of oversight that characterized frontier life could be exploited by those who would prey upon the vulnerable in the name of scientific progress. It also highlights the terrible burden carried by those who stumbled upon such crimes, but found themselves powerless to seek justice through conventional means. What is perhaps most chilling is the thought that Margaret Hayes may not have been unique. The vast, sparsely populated wilderness of early 19th century America provided countless opportunities for those with dark intentions to exploit the isolated and defenseless. How many other victims whose suffering was known only to their tormentors, and perhaps a few witnesses who chose silence, were scattered across the frontier? The official records of Margaret Hayes's case remain sealed in the Athens County Courthouse, available only to those who can prove a legitimate academic interest in early American medical history. Dr. Hartwell's letter to the State Attorney General was never sent, and the copies of Cunningham's journal that he claimed to have made were never found among his possessions after his death. This mystery serves as a haunting reminder of the terrifying reality that the most evil acts are sometimes committed by those society trusts, the most individuals who take sacred oaths to do no harm, but who hide behind their respectability and authority to commit unspeakable crimes. The case also reminds us that the price of scientific progress must never include the suffering of the innocent, and those who pursue knowledge at any cost must be held accountable for their actions. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Could there have been other victims whose stories were never told? Scattered across the remote settlements of early America. Leave your comments below and share your thoughts about this dark chapter in medical history. If you enjoyed this tale and want more dark mysteries from America's past, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves historical mysteries that reveal the hidden horrors of our nation's early years. See you in the next video. Thank you all very much for watching my video until the end. I sincerely appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.